Let me start with a number 273. That is not a statistic, that is not a target, that is the number of women who will walk into India's parliament in 2029. Not because someone was generous enough to let them in, but because the constitution now demands it. 273 seats reserved, non negotiable. Now, you have probably heard the debates. You have heard the celebration, the criticism, the politics around it. But I want you to forget all of that for a moment because the real question nobody is asking is very simple actually. What does this actually mean? Not symbolically, not politically. What does it mean in the morning, in the courtroom, in the hospital ward, in the budget allocation meeting? What changes in the life of a woman in Sitapur or Salem or Siliguri? 273 women sit in that gleaming new parliament building. That is what we are going to talk about. Look, every civilization has had this moment, this inflection point where it has to decide whether it genuinely believes its own founding promises. The French Revolution promised liberty, equality, fraternity, and then took another 150 years to let women vote. America declared that all men are created equal and then spent 2 centuries arguing about whether men actually meant people. India granted universal adult franchise in 1950, decades before Switzerland, by the way, and then spent 70 years watching its parliament remain an overwhelmingly male institution. 13.6% female representation after the 2024 elections, down for 14.4 in 2019. Now, that is not stagnation, that is regression. So, when the 106th Amendment passed in September 2023 with 454 votes in favor and 2 against, that was not consensus. That was embarrassment finally converting into action. 27 years of failed attempts, 4 dead bills, one successful Rajya Sabha vote in 2010 that the Lok Sabha simply refused to touch. The idea of women in parliament was not controversial, it was inconvenient. And that is a difference. And even after the 106th Amendment passed, the government tied implementation to a future census and a future delimitation, which effectively meant the quota might not kick in until 2034. 8 more years of waiting for a promise already 27 years overdue. The April 2026 bills, the 131st Amendment, and the Delimitation Bill, they bypassed that delay by using the 2011 census data. And that is why 2029 is now real, not aspirational, but real. But here is where I need you to think carefully because the hard part is not getting women into parliament. The hard part is making sure they actually govern once they get there. India already ran this experiment at the grassroots level. The 73rd and 74th Amendments in 1992 reserved one third of seats in local governance for women. Today, there are over 1.4 million elected women in panchayats across this country, 46% of all local representatives. 19 states went further and made it 50%. By raw numbers, India is a global leader in female political participation at the local level. And yet, this is the part that should disturb us. Alongside this extraordinary success runs a deeply uncomfortable phenomenon called the Sarpanchpati syndrome. The husband of the Sarpanch. The seat is reserved for a woman, so the local power broker feeds his wife, his daughter, his sister, and then she wins. He governs, she signs, he decides, she sits in the chair, he holds the power. This is not anecdotal, this is systematic. In many regions, the elected woman has never attended a single Gram Sabha meeting. Her husband goes instead. Her name is on the register, his voice is in the room. Now multiply that by the stakes of national parliament. 273 seats. If even a significant fraction of those seats produce sarpanch patis at the national level, husbands and fathers pulling strings from behind the curtain, then what India will have achieved is not empowerment. It is the world's most elaborate puppet show. Simone de Beauvoir wrote something in 1949 that still cuts. Representation is not liberation. You can put a woman in a chair. That does not mean you have freed her to speak. The chair is necessary, but the chair is not sufficient. So, what makes the difference between a quota that transforms and a quota that performs? Evidence, actual evidence. And here is where it gets genuinely hopeful. Economists who have studied women led panchayats, not the proxy ones, the real ones, where women actually exercised authority, found something remarkable. These constituencies saw significantly higher investment in drinking water infrastructure, rural roads, sanitation, and minor irrigation. Not because women are inherently more virtuous, that is a lazy and patronizing argument, but because women legislators tend to fund what they have lived. They have carried the water, they have walked the broken road, they have dealt with the absence of a functioning toilet. Their policy priorities are not ideological, they are autobiographical. And the data goes further. Female political leadership correlates with reduced infant mortality, better access to clean water, higher learning adjusted years of schooling. In Maharashtra recently, female representatives pushed for menopause clinics across 580 medical facilities, serving over 31,000 women whose health care needs male legislators had never been considered, not out of malice, out of blindness. You cannot legislate for experiences you have never had. There is also this stunning finding: male legislators who win closely contested elections are roughly 3 times more likely to have pending criminal charges than their female counterparts. Women in office accumulate personal assets at significantly lower rates. A quarter of the economic growth advantage in female led constituencies is explained simply by reduced corruption, simply by electing people who are less likely to steal. But, and I will not pretend this away, there is a deep structural flaw in this legislation that nobody in power wants to talk about honestly: the OBC subquota, or rather, the absence of one. The reservation guarantees seats for SC and ST women within the broader quota that mirrors existing constitutional provisions, but OBC women who belong to communities constituting anywhere between 41 and 52% of this country have no dedicated subquota. None. Now why does this matter? Because gender is not a monolith. A Thakur woman from a political dynasty in western UP and a Yadav woman running a small shop in Madhubani do not face the same barriers. They do not have the same access to party networks, campaign financing, media visibility, or even basic name recognition. Without an intersectional framework, the 273 seats risk being captured disproportionately by women who are already proximate to power. Upper caste, urban, educated, politically connected. The quota becomes a class elevator for the privileged, while the women it was ostensibly designed for watch from the ground floor. And I personally believe that if we want to defeat the point 0.5 front, we have to unite the Hindus. And in order to unite Hindus, we shall have to empower our women across all castes and tribes. There is no better way and there is no fastest way. The government's legal defense is technically sound. The Supreme Court's triple test jurisprudence makes an OBC subquota constitutionally complex without robust caste enumeration data. But constitutional complexity is not the same as moral resolution. This remains an open wound. And then there is the question that connects this legislation to the deepest structural tension in Indian democracy: delimitation, the North South divide. You cannot talk about the Women's Reservation Bill without talking about this, because the government has deliberately bundled them together. The Lok Sabha is expanding to roughly 816 seats. The new seats will be distributed based on the 2011 census, which means population, which means the north, which grew faster, gets dramatically more seats. Uttar Pradesh goes from 80 to 120, Bihar from 40 to 60. Meanwhile, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, the states that actually followed the national family planning policy, invested in women's education, brought their fertility rates down, they get proportionally diluted. Their share of parliament shrinks. Their reward for doing the right thing is less voice in their own democracy. Southern leaders are calling the women's reservation a Trojan horse, a noble cause being used as political cover for a demographic power grab. And you know what? You can entirely dismiss that reading when you bundle genuine gender justice with a delimitation exercise that fundamentally reshapes federal power. You're asking people to choose between the two things they should never have to choose between. But step back from the politics for a moment. Step back from the OBC question, the delimitation fight, the proxy problem. Step back and ask the only question that ultimately matters. Is this country better off with 273 women in parliament or without them? The philosopher John Rawls proposed a thought experiment. Imagine you are designing a society from behind a wheel of ignorance. You do not know whether you will be born male or female, north or south, upper caste or lower caste. What system would you design? No rational person behind that wheel would design a parliament that is 86% male. No rational person would look at the exposed wiring of Indian governance, the criminality, the patronage networks, the policy blindness toward half the population and say, yes, this is working, do not change it. 273 is not a perfect number. The legislation is not a perfect instrument. The proxy problem is real. The OBC exclusion is real. The federal tension is also very real. But for the first time in the history of this republic, the constitution does not merely permit women to enter parliament, it demands their presence. And that is not a gift, it is a correction, 75 years overdue. The real test is not 2029, the real test is 2034 and 2039, whether the women who enter parliament as quota beneficiaries become legislators in their own right, whether the Sarpanchpati syndrome is broken or replicated, whether OVC women eventually find their place in this framework, whether the daughters of this country inherit not just seats but power. That is something no amendment can guarantee. That part is on us. Thanks for watching. Namaskar.